The United States military in the World War II produced some of the most celebrated soldiers in history. But inside that same military, there were men who operated by a completely different set of rules. Men who were feared not just by the enemy, but sometimes by their own side. Their stories have been quietly kept out of most history books, until now. Before getting into the individuals, it helps to start with the unit that became the benchmark by which American ferocity in World War II is measured, the 1st Special Service Force, better known to the Germans who faced them as the Devil's Brigade. The 1st Special Service Force was a joint American-Canadian unit created in 1942 and trained at Fort William Henry Harrison in Helena, Montana. Originally conceived for a mission to parachute into Norway and destroy hydroelectric plants supplying German industry, the unit was redirected to the Italian theater when that mission was canceled, where it became one of the most feared formations in the entire Allied order of battle. The unit was small by conventional standards, approximately 1,800 men at full strength, but its selection and training process was unlike anything else in the American or Canadian military at the time. Candidates were screened for physical fitness, intelligence, and psychological resilience. Training covered parachuting, skiing, rock climbing, hand-to-hand combat, demolitions, and small unit tactics. Men who could not keep pace were removed. What remained was a force capable of operating in terrain and conditions that would have stopped conventional infantry entirely. In Italy, the force was deployed against the Winter Line, the series of German defensive positions that had halted the Allied advance in late 1943 and early 1944. The mountains in this sector were held by German units that had assessed them as essentially unassailable. The terrain was nearly vertical, the weather brutal, and any direct approach would be destroyed by prepared defenses. The 1st Special Service Force went up the cliff face of Monte la Defensa on the night of December 2, 1943, climbing in darkness and silence, without the Germans knowing they were coming. When they reached the top, the fighting was immediate, close, and decisive. The German defenders were overwhelmed before they could fully respond. What made the force particularly feared afterward was not just their tactical effectiveness, but their psychological approach. They developed a deliberate practice of silent night raids on German positions, moving through enemy lines, neutralizing targets without firing weapons that would alert the broader defensive network, and leaving behind calling cards with the unit's insignia. The Germans eventually issued a specific directive about these troops, warning that their tactics represented a threat that standard defensive procedures could not adequately counter. They called them the Black Devils, a reference to the black camouflage face paint the force wore on night operations. The Devil's Brigade operated as a unit, but some of the most extraordinary stories from the American side of World War II involve individual soldiers, men whose personal combat records stretched the boundaries of what seemed humanly possible. Audie Murphy grew up in poverty in rural Texas, the 7th of 12 children born to sharecropper parents. His father abandoned the family when Audie was a child, and the death of his mother in 1941, when he was 16, left him responsible for younger siblings. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Murphy tried to enlist immediately. He was turned down by the Marines and the Army paratroopers. Both considered him too small and too young. The Army infantry eventually accepted him in 1942 when he was 17. By the time the war ended in 1945, Audie Murphy had received 33 military decorations, including the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States awards. He is the most decorated American combat soldier of World War II. The list of his decorations includes the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, 2 Bronze Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. The specific action that earned Murphy the Medal of Honor took place on January 26, 1945, near Holtzwihr in northeastern France. His unit, Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, was in a defensive position when a German attack began, involving 2 companies of infantry supported by 6 tanks. The attack was substantial enough that Murphy ordered his men to withdraw to the cover of the trees behind the position. Murphy himself did not withdraw. He positioned himself on a burning tank destroyer, an armored vehicle that had been hit and was on fire, its ammunition potentially about to cook off, and used its mounted machine gun to engage the German infantry. He was exposed on a vehicle that could have exploded at any moment in temperatures well below freezing. He called in artillery fire on his own position, directing the shells to within 50 meters of where he was standing. He held his position for approximately an hour. When the artillery and his own fire combined to break the German attack, he rejoined his men and led a counterattack on the German positions. The citation for his Medal of Honor noted that he killed or wounded approximately 50 German soldiers during the engagement. What the citation does not fully convey is the broader context of Murphy's combat record. By the time of the Holtzwihr engagement, he had already been wounded 3 times. He had been in combat continuously for more than a year across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany. He had watched men he knew die in numbers that were difficult to process. And he continued to function in combat at a level that his superiors, his peers, and the Germans facing him all found extraordinary. After the war, Murphy was open about the psychological weight he carried, the difficulty of sleeping, the persistence of the memories, the distance he felt from civilian life. He advocated publicly for veterans struggling with the psychological aftermath of combat at a time when that advocacy was not common or particularly welcomed by the military establishment. Murphy died in a plane crash in 1971 at 45. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, where his grave is among the most visited. Murphy's story is the most famous individual combat record of World War II. But there were other men whose actions, less publicized, less celebrated, were in their own ways just as extraordinary, and in some cases considerably more difficult to explain by any ordinary measure of what a human being is capable of. Mitchell Red Cloud Jr. was a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, born in Hatfield, Wisconsin in 1924. He had already served in the Marine Corps during World War II, before enlisting in the Army and finding himself in Korea. But his story is inseparable from the broader story of Native American soldiers in the American military during the mid-20th century, a group whose combat records were consistently extraordinary and whose recognition was consistently inadequate. Red Cloud served in Company E, 19th Infantry Regiment, 24th Infantry Division. In the early hours of November 5, 1950, his unit was in position near Chonghyon, North Korea, when a massive Chinese assault began. The Chinese forces had recently entered the Korean War in force, and the assault on Red Cloud's position was part of a large-scale offensive aimed at overwhelming American and United Nations positions across the front. Red Cloud was on guard when the attack began. He detected the advancing Chinese forces and immediately opened fire, shouting warnings to his fellow soldiers and buying them time to respond to an attack that had come without warning in darkness and cold. He was wounded almost immediately, shot through the chest, but did not stop firing and did not call for help. What happened next was documented by the soldiers who were present and by the subsequent investigation that led to his posthumous Medal of Honor. Wounded and unable to stand, Red Cloud wrapped his arm around a tree to support himself and continued firing. He held his position until his ammunition was exhausted. He died at his post. The time he had bought allowed his unit to organize a defense and hold its position against an attack that might otherwise have overrun it entirely. His Medal of Honor was presented posthumously to his family. His mother received it. Red Cloud's action fits within a pattern that appears repeatedly in the combat records of Native American soldiers in World War II and Korea. Extraordinary individual courage in defensive situations, a willingness to absorb personal destruction rather than allow a position to collapse. The reasons are complex and involve both cultural traditions around warfare and honor, and the specific position that Native American soldiers occupied within the American military. Motivated by a combination of patriotism and a determination to demonstrate something specific to a country that had treated their communities so poorly. The combat records of Native American soldiers in World War II are among the most remarkable and least adequately recognized in American military history. The United States Army Ranger battalions of World War II were among the most specifically prepared units in the American military, trained for assault operations against fixed positions and for the kind of close, violent fighting that conventional infantry training did not emphasize. Their record across the war, in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, and in France, reflected both the quality of their preparation and the nature of the operations they were assigned. No single Ranger action is more documented or more studied than the assault by the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions on Omaha Beach and Pointe du Hoc on June 6, 1944, the opening day of the Allied invasion of Normandy. The 2nd Ranger Battalion was assigned to scale the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, a promontory on the Normandy coast approximately 4 miles west of Omaha Beach, where German gun positions were believed to be capable of firing on both Omaha and Utah beaches during the invasion. The Rangers were to land at the base of the cliffs, climb them using ropes and grappling hooks fired by rocket launchers, neutralize the German positions at the top, and hold the position until relieved. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc are approximately 100 feet high. The Rangers climbed them under fire, with German defenders cutting ropes, dropping grenades, and shooting down at the men ascending below them. The Rangers reached the top, overcame the defenders, and discovered that the guns they had been sent to destroy had already been moved from their emplacements. They had been relocated inland before the invasion. Ranger patrols moved inland, found the guns in an apple orchard approximately a mile from the cliffs, and destroyed them before returning to the position. The Rangers then held Pointe du Hoc for 2 days and nights against German counterattacks, without the relief force that was supposed to reach them within hours. Of the approximately 225 Rangers who landed at Pointe du Hoc, fewer than 90 were able to bear arms at the end of the 2-day action. The rest were dead or wounded. Meanwhile, at Omaha Beach itself, the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions came ashore into the same catastrophic fire, killing the conventional infantry around them. Brigadier General Norman Cota, the Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, moved among the Rangers on the beach and gave an order documented in multiple accounts, directing the Rangers specifically, by name, to lead the way off the beach and up the bluffs. It was addressed to them because of who they were. The Rangers moved, they found gaps in the German defenses, climbed the bluffs under fire, and cleared German positions from above, an action that helped open the beach enough for subsequent waves to advance. Their specific contribution to breaking the stalemate on Omaha Beach that morning was documented by commanders present and has been consistently recognized in historical analysis of the battle. There are soldiers who perform extraordinary acts of valor once and spend the rest of their lives in the shadow of that moment. John Basilone was not one of them. He performed extraordinary acts of valor twice, in 2 different wars, and died in the second. Basilone was born in 1916 in Buffalo, New York, the 6th of 10 children in an Italian-American family. He enlisted in the Army at 17 and served a tour in the Philippines before returning to civilian life. When the war began, he re-enlisted, this time in the Marine Corps. By October 1942, Basilone was a sergeant with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, fighting on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The battle for Guadalcanal was one of the most brutal of the Pacific Campaign, fought in dense jungle, in debilitating heat, against a Japanese military that had demonstrated it would fight to the last man. On the night of October 24th to 25th, 1942, Japanese forces launched a massive assault on the Marine positions along the Matanikaw River, specifically targeting the position held by Basilone's machine gun section. The assault involved hundreds of Japanese soldiers attempting to overrun a position held by a fraction of that number. Basilone kept 2 water-cooled .30 caliber machine guns firing through the night. When the guns jammed, which they did repeatedly under the sustained firing rate, he cleared them by hand, burning his hands on the barrels in the process. When ammunition ran low, he moved through Japanese fire to bring additional ammunition to the guns. When the gun crews around him were killed or wounded, he moved the guns himself and fired them from new positions to continue covering the approaches. The assault lasted throughout the night. By dawn, the Japanese attack had been broken. The Marines held their position. Bodies were later counted in the hundreds in the approaches Basilone's guns had covered. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for the Guadalcanal action and was subsequently sent back to the United States to participate in a war bond tour, a common practice for decorated heroes who were considered more valuable as public figures than as combat soldiers. Basilone reportedly found the experience deeply uncomfortable and repeatedly requested to return to combat. After approximately a year, the Marine Corps agreed. He went back to the Pacific as a gunnery sergeant with the 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division. He landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, in the first wave of the assault on one of the most heavily fortified islands the Marines had ever attacked. Within hours of landing, Basilone was killed by Japanese mortar fire. He was 28 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration in the Navy and Marine Corps, for his actions on Iwo Jima. Basilone is one of the very few enlisted Marines to have received both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. His story represents something specific about the soldiers this video examines. Not men who were extraordinary once, under extreme circumstances, and then stepped back. Men who went back into the fire by choice. While units like the Rangers and the 1st Special Service Force operated with the support of their parent organizations and within recognized command structures, the Alamo Scouts existed in a different category entirely. A small reconnaissance unit operating in the Pacific Theater that conducted some of the most dangerous missions of the war, with almost no public recognition during or after the conflict. The Alamo Scouts were established in November 1943 by General Walter Kruger, commander of the 6th U.S. Army, specifically for deep reconnaissance behind Japanese lines in the Southwest Pacific. Their primary mission was to go where no unit was supposed to be able to go, behind the Japanese perimeter, into territory where any contact with the enemy meant almost certain death or capture, gather intelligence, and return. The selection process for the Alamo Scouts was designed to eliminate anyone who was not physically and psychologically suited to operating in complete isolation, in extreme conditions, without any possibility of rescue if things went wrong. Candidates came from regular Army units and were subjected to a screening process that assessed their ability to navigate, to survive in the jungle, to remain calm under extreme stress, and to function as part of a very small team with minimal external support. The teams that resulted from this selection process, typically 5 to 7 men, operated throughout New Guinea, the Philippines, and the surrounding islands. They landed by boat or submarine on enemy-held coastlines, moved through jungle to observation positions near Japanese installations, recorded troop numbers, locations, and movements, and extracted back to Allied lines, sometimes after days behind enemy lines, living entirely off the land and whatever supplies they had carried in. In their operational history from 1944 to the end of the war, the Alamo Scouts conducted more than 80 missions. They never lost a man killed in action on a mission. They never had a man captured by the Japanese. This record, maintained across more than 80 operations in environments where any mistake could be fatal, is one of the most remarkable in the history of American special operations. Their most celebrated mission was the Cabanatuan Raid in January 1945, a combined operation with Army Rangers and Filipino guerrillas to free more than 500 American prisoners held at the Cabanatuan prison camp in the Philippines. The Alamo Scouts infiltrated the area around the camp in advance of the raid, reconnoitered the Japanese positions, and provided the intelligence that made the Rangers' assault both possible and successful. The raid freed 511 prisoners, survivors of the Bataan Death March, without losing a single Ranger or Scout during the operation itself. The Alamo Scouts were deactivated in 1945 and remained largely unknown to the American public for decades. Their operational records were classified, their missions undocumented in the public history of the war. Most of what the American public knows about Special Operations Forces, the selection processes, the small team philosophy, the emphasis on intelligence and precision, has its direct roots in what the Alamo Scouts developed in the Pacific. If the Alamo Scouts represent the professional, methodical extreme of American combat effectiveness in World War II, Jack Lucas represents something closer to the raw, uncontainable impulse that produced some of the war's most singular individual actions. Lucas was born in 1928 in North Carolina. He lied about his age to enlist in the Marine Corps at 14, one of the youngest recruits in the Corps' history. By the time of the Iwo Jima invasion in February 1945, he was 17 years old and had made it to the Pacific by stowing away on a ship because his unit was being held back and he was determined not to miss the fighting. He went ashore with the assault waves on February 19, 1945, technically AWOL and without a rifle. He had to take a weapon from a dead Marine on the beach. On February 20th, 1945, the second day of the battle, Lucas was with a small group of Marines moving through a trench system when two Japanese grenades landed in the trench among them. Lucas threw himself onto the grenades, both of them. He pulled one under his body and pulled the other under his arm, using his own body as a shield for the men around him. One grenade detonated. The explosion drove metal fragments throughout his body. He later required more than 20 surgical operations to remove the fragments. The second grenade, remarkably, did not detonate, a failure that medical personnel involved in his treatment subsequently credited as the reason he survived at all. Lucas was 17 years old when he received the Medal of Honor, the youngest recipient in World War II, and one of the youngest in the decoration's history. President Harry Truman, presenting the medal, was documented as having said that he would rather have the medal than be president, an expression of the weight of what Lucas had done, delivered from the most powerful office in the country. Lucas survived the war, survived the surgeries, and lived until 2008. He died at 79 years old. In the decades between Iwo Jima and his death, he remained one of the most direct and unvarnished of the Medal of Honor recipients in discussing his experience, describing the moment in the trench not as a calculated decision, but as something that simply happened, an instinct that moved faster than thought. That description, the instinct that moves faster than thought, appears in many accounts from the soldiers in this video. It is perhaps the most honest explanation any of them offered for what they had done. Beyond the conventional military units and the special operations forces that operated within recognizable command structures, World War II produced a category of American soldiers who operated in an entirely different framework. The men of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, who were the forerunners of what would eventually become the Central Intelligence Agency. The OSS was established in 1942 under the direction of General William Wild Bill Donovan, a World War I veteran and the Medal of Honor recipient who had been tasked by President Roosevelt with building an American intelligence and special operations capability from essentially nothing. Donovan recruited broadly, from law firms, from universities, from the business world, from among recent immigrants who spoke the languages of occupied Europe and had personal stakes in the outcome of the war. What the OSS produced in operational terms was a range of activities that spanned intelligence collection, sabotage, psychological warfare, and direct support to resistance movements in occupied countries. OSS officers were parachuted into occupied France, into Yugoslavia, into Greece, into Burma, and into dozens of other locations where they lived under cover identities, worked with local resistance forces, and conducted operations that bore no resemblance to conventional military action. The psychological demands of OSS work were different in kind from those facing conventional combat soldiers. A ranger on Pointe du Hoc faced extreme danger for a concentrated period of hours. An OSS officer undercover in occupied France might face sustained danger for months or years. The constant threat of discovery, the knowledge that capture meant interrogation by the Gestapo and almost certain death, and responsibility for the lives of the local people assisting the mission. Virginia Hall was perhaps the most extraordinary of the American OSS operatives in Europe, a former diplomat who had lost part of her leg in a hunting accident and who operated in occupied France for years, organizing resistance networks, coordinating arms drops, and directing sabotage operations. The Gestapo identified her as a priority target and devoted considerable resources to finding her. She evaded them throughout, including an escape over the Pyrenees into Spain in winter, on her prosthetic leg. She was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross after the war, at a private ceremony held at her own request. The OSS men and women who operated in the Pacific Theater, specifically in Burma, faced conditions equally demanding. OSS, Detachment 101, operated in Burma from 1942 to 1945, building and directing a guerrilla force drawn primarily from the Kachin people of northern Burma that eventually numbered in the thousands. Detachment 101 operations resulted in the deaths of thousands of Japanese soldiers and the disruption of Japanese supply and communication lines in ways that contributed directly to Allied campaigns in the region. The OSS was disbanded in 1945, shortly after the war ended. Its records were classified, its personnel dispersed into civilian life and into the intelligence agencies that succeeded it. The methods they developed became the foundation of American covert operations, capability for the remainder of the century. The soldiers in this video, from the Devil's Brigade to the Alamo Scouts, from Audie Murphy to Jack Lucas, from John Basilone to the OSS operatives in occupied France, do not represent the average American fighting man of World War II. They represent the extreme edge of what that generation produced under the specific pressures of the most destructive conflict in human history. What they share is harder to define than their individual records. It is not simply physical courage, though all of them had that in quantities that exceeded what training could produce. It is something closer to a specific relationship with danger, an ability to function, to think, and to act in environments where the objective conditions argued for paralysis or retreat. The military institutions they served tried, with varying success, to identify and cultivate this quality in advance, through selection processes, through training, through the organizational cultures that shaped units like the Rangers and the Alamo Scouts. Sometimes it worked. The Alamo Scouts' record of 80-plus missions without a fatality is evidence of what rigorous selection and preparation can accomplish. But the stories of individual soldiers, Murphy on the burning tank destroyer, Lucas throwing himself onto 2 grenades, Basilone returning to the Pacific when he could have spent the war selling bonds, suggests something that selection and training alone cannot account for. There is a category of action in these records that goes beyond what any institutional process could prepare someone for. The men who came home were not unchanged. Murphy's openness about the psychological cost of what he had been through was unusual for his time, but not unique. Many veterans whose combat records were most extreme also carried the heaviest psychological weight in the years that followed. The post-war American military and society were not well equipped to acknowledge or address that connection. What they left behind, beyond the decorations, beyond the unit histories, was the knowledge that ordinary men, under extraordinary circumstances, are capable of things that exceed any ordinary measure. The specific names in this video are the ones that appear in the records. Behind them were men whose moments of extraordinary individual decision happened without a witness in a position to write it down. The recorded stories are the ones we can tell. The unrecorded ones may be just as extraordinary. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.